My name is Maya, and I am 32 years old. But 3 weeks ago, my life as I knew it ended and a new one began. Imagine standing in a giant, expensive ballroom filled with 200 of the richest people in the city, where the air smells like fancy perfume and the floor is polished like a mirror. My father, Richard Reynolds, stood on the stage at the head of a mahogany table that probably cost more than I earn in an entire year. He was celebrating his retirement after 40 years of building a massive financial empire. He held up a crystal glass of champagne, looked directly at me with eyes as cold as ice, and announced to every relative, business partner, and journalist in the room that he was proud of all his children except for the failure sitting at table 12. He didn't whisper it or pull me aside to be kind. He said it loudly so that everyone could hear. The whole room erupted in laughter. My brother actually applauded, and my stepmother, Linda, wore a smile like she had been waiting 27 years for that exact moment of humiliation. But I didn't cry, and I didn't flinch. Instead, I stood up with a calm heart, walked slowly up to the stage through the sea of mocking faces, and placed a small silver USB drive right on his plate. I leaned in and whispered, "Happy retirement, Dad. You always said I didn't have the killer instinct, but tonight, when you plug this in, you'll realize that being quiet was my greatest weapon." Then I simply walked out of the room. As the heavy doors closed behind me, I heard a scream so loud it echoed through the entire mansion. Before I tell you exactly what was on that drive and how I erased every single penny of his $400 million net worth, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you believe that being underestimated is actually a superpower, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now, let me take you back 2 months earlier, to the day everything really started. I was working in the shadows of my father's company, Reynolds International, as a senior systems analyst. While my father spent his days in boardrooms making loud speeches, I spent my nights in the server rooms, building the digital architecture that kept his money moving. I was the one who fixed the glitches, optimized the portfolios, and made sure the system never crashed. To the world, I was invisible, but to the computer servers, I was the queen. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I was tucked away in a corner of the main office, hidden by a stack of files, when my father walked in with his top advisor, Victor Hale. Victor was a man who wore suits that cost $5,000 but had a soul that was worth nothing. They didn't know I was there, and I listened as my father laughed about how he planned to leave me out of his will entirely. He told Victor that I was just a useful tool with no spark, and that once he retired, he would replace me with a cheaper coder and let me struggle on my own. Hearing those words didn't just hurt my feelings, it woke me up. I realized that my father didn't just dislike me. He didn't respect the very person who had spent a decade protecting his fortune. That was the moment I stopped being a loyal daughter and started looking for the safety switch I had hidden in the code years ago. I knew that my father was hiding money in offshore accounts to avoid taxes, and I knew Victor was helping him. I decided right then that if I was a loser in his eyes, I would show him exactly how much a loser could take away when she knows where all the digital bodies are buried. NDS, IDS, by no PS, every dire day. I went back to my apartment that night, but I didn't sleep. The silence of my living room felt different now. It wasn't a lonely silence, but the quiet before a storm. I opened my laptop and the blue light hit my face like a cold splash of water. For years, I had used my skills to protect my father's legacy, but tonight I was going to use them to look under the floorboards of his empire. My father thought he was a genius because he could shout the loudest in a boardroom, but he didn't realize that in the modern world, power isn't made of gold, it's made of data. I started by accessing the core servers of Reynolds International. I had built these servers myself 6 years ago, and I knew every digital brick and every hidden hallway in the code. Back then, I was a naive daughter who wanted to make sure her father's business was safe from hackers, so I had built a very special, very secret safety switch. In the world of computer programming, we call this a logic bomb or a backdoor, but I liked to think of it as a truth seeker. I designed it so that if the owner of the system ever started moving money in a way that looked like a crime, like hiding taxes or stealing from employees, the system would flag it for a deep audit that even the CEO couldn't stop. I began to run a search through the encrypted folders that even Victor Hale, my father's greedy advisor, couldn't see. As the progress bar moved across my screen, my heart hammered against my ribs. I found a folder named Project Sunshine. It sounded cheerful, but as I clicked through the spreadsheets, I realized it was the darkest thing I had ever seen. My father wasn't just a mean man. He was a thief. He had been taking small amounts of money, just a few dollars here and there, from the pension funds of his longest-serving employees. These were people like Mr. Dewey's, Henderson, the janitor who had worked for the company for 30 years, and Sarah, the receptionist who always brought me cookies when I was a little girl. My father was stealing their retirement so he could buy his third private jet. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I realized that while I was working late nights to keep the company stable, he was using that stability to rob the very people who built his success. I spent the next 5 hours downloading every fake invoice and every secret transfer to offshore banks in the Cayman Islands. I watched the numbers move on the screen, millions of dollars flying away from honest workers and landing in my father's secret accounts. Victor Hale's digital signature was all over these files. Victor thought he was being clever by using encrypted passwords, but he used the same password for everything, winner take all 77. It was so arrogant, so typical of the men in that office. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that the loser at table 12 was the only person who actually understood how the Reynolds fortune worked. My father and Victor were like children playing with a high-powered machine they didn't understand. They thought the computer was just a calculator, but to me, it was a living map of their greed. I found a hidden ledger that showed Richard had lied to the government about his earnings for the last 12 years. If the IRS saw this, he wouldn't just be poor. He would be in a jumpsuit that matched the orange of a warning sign. But I didn't want him in jail yet. I wanted him to feel what I felt, the feeling of having nothing, of being invisible, of being told you don't matter. I began to write a new script, a piece of code that would act like a digital ghost. It would wait until the moment he plugged my USB drive into his computer. Once he did that, the code would wake up and send all this evidence to the authorities while simultaneously locking every single one of his credit cards and bank accounts. I was essentially building a digital cage for a lion who didn't know he was being hunted. Around 4 a.m., I hit a snag. I noticed that Victor had installed a watchdog program. If anyone tried to download the Project Sunshine files, a silent alarm would go off on Victor's phone. My breath hitched. I had already downloaded 60% of the data. I had to think fast. This is where my loser instinct saved me. My father harked on about killer instinct being about aggression, but I knew that real instinct was about patience and precision. Instead of trying to bypass the alarm, I created a mirror file. I made the system think the files were still there, while I slowly siphoned the real data through a side channel I had created in a printer software. Nobody ever checks the printer software. It was slow, agonizingly slow. I watched the percentage climb. 61, 62, 63. Every time the floorboards in my apartment creaked, I jumped, thinking Victor's security team was at my door, but they weren't. They were sleeping in their expensive beds, dreaming of more money, while I was sitting in the dark, taking it all back. By the time the sun started to peek over the city skyline, I had it all. 10 years of lies, 6 years of theft, and one giant secret that would destroy my father's reputation forever. I saved everything onto the silver USB drive, the same one I would later hand to him at the party. I looked at that small piece of metal and plastic, and realized it held more power than all of Richard Reynolds' speeches. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was the auditor of his soul. As I closed my laptop, I looked at a photo of my mother on my desk. She had a kind smile, the kind of smile my father had spent years trying to erase from my face. "I'm doing this for us, Mom," I whispered. I knew the next few weeks would be a game of cat and mouse. I had to go to work every day, look Victor in the eye, and pretend I was still the useful tool they thought I was. I had to let them insult me, let them give me more work, and let them laugh at my simple clothes. Every time they did, I just thought about the silver drive in my pocket. The discovery was over. The hunt had officially begun. I walked into my childhood home the next day, not as a daughter, but as a detective. The house was a cold, 3-story mansion in the suburbs, filled with expensive furniture that nobody was allowed to sit on and white carpets that were never supposed to have a speck of dirt. My father was at the office, and my stepmother, Linda, was at her weekly spa day, so the house was empty and quiet. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where a small door led to the attic. This was the only part of the house Richard never visited, because it reminded him of the past, and he was a man who only cared about the future and his next $1 million. The attic was dusty and smelled like old paper and dried lavender. I spent hours moving heavy boxes until I found a blue trunk with my mother's name, Elaine, written on a faded tag. My heart hammered in my chest as I opened it. Inside were her old dresses, some pressed flowers, and at the very bottom a leather-bound diary. This wasn't just a book of thoughts. It was a record of the truth my father had tried to bury for 30 years. As I turned the yellowed pages, I realized that the success story Richard told the world was a lie. My mother had inherited a massive amount of money from her own parents, And Richard hadn't built his first company from nothing, as he claimed in every interview. He had taken her money, manipulated her while she was young, and used her kindness to fuel his greed. But the entries from the final year of her life were the hardest to read. She wrote about how Richard would leave her alone in the hospital while she was fighting for her life, only visiting to ask her to sign legal documents that gave him more power over her bank accounts. She wrote that she knew he was seeing another woman, Linda, even before she had passed away. One line stood out to me and made me drop the book. He tells me I am weak because I care about people, but I fear he is building a kingdom where love is a crime and money is the only god. I hope Maya grows up with my heart in his brain, so she can survive him. Reading those words felt like a physical blow. For years, I had blamed myself for not being good enough for him, but now I saw that he was incapable of seeing value in anything that wasn't a dollar sign. Anything that wasn't a dollar sign. He didn't just ignore me. He had actively tried to crush the parts of me that reminded him of my mother. I realized that my plan to erase his net worth wasn't just about revenge for the loser comment at the party. It was about returning the stolen legacy to where it belonged. My mother's diary gave me the final piece of the puzzle. She mentioned a secret trust fund she had set up for me, one that Richard had tried to break into but couldn't, because it required a biometric key, my fingerprint. I searched through the back of the diary and found a small, old-fashioned safety deposit key taped to the last page. This key didn't lead to a bank. It led to a private vault in the city that Richard didn't even know existed. I spent the next 4 hours in that attic, documenting every page of the diary with my phone. I knew that if Richard found out I had this, he would try to destroy it. I wasn't just collecting financial data anymore. I was collecting his sins. As I left the attic and walked down the grand staircase, I looked at the giant portrait of Richard in the hallway. He looked so powerful, so untouchable. But I knew the truth now. He was a hollow man sitting on a throne of stolen dreams. I spent the next week living a double life. During the day, I sat at my desk in the office, typing away, and letting Victor Hale dump extra work on my plate. I let him call me sweetie and kid, while I smiled and said, thank you. Inside, I was laughing because I had already mapped out every one of Victor's secret accounts too. I found out that Victor wasn't just helping my dad. He was stealing from my dad, too. It was a circle of thieves. I decided that when I hit the delete button on Richard's life, Victor would go down with him. I started building a second file on the USB drive, one labeled the auditor's report. This file was designed to look like a standard company update, but it was actually a Trojan horse. The moment it was opened on a high-level executive computer, it would broadcast the evidence of the pension theft to every single employee in the company. I wanted them to see who their hero really was. I wanted the janitor and the receptionist to know that their missing retirement money was currently sitting in a Swiss bank account under Richard's name. This wasn't just about making him poor. It was about making him small. One evening, Linda invited me to dinner. It was rare for her to want to see me, so I knew something was up. We sat in a cold, modern restaurant, where the portions were tiny and the prices were huge. Linda spent 30 minutes bragging about the new diamond necklace Richard had bought her for the retirement party. She looked at my simple watch and laughed, saying, Maya, you really should try harder. No wonder your father worries about your future. You have no style, no ambition. You're just like your mother, always content with the little things. I took a slow sip of my water and looked her right in the eyes. I didn't get angry. I just smiled and said, You're right, Linda. I am a lot like my mother. And you'd be surprised how much the little things can actually matter when they all add up. She didn't understand what I meant, and she just rolled her eyes and went back to talking about her jewelry. She didn't realize that the necklace she was wearing was bought with money stolen from 1,000 different people. She didn't realize that in a few weeks, she would have to sell that necklace, just to pay for a lawyer. By the time I got home that night, I felt a strange sense of peace. The discovery phase was complete. I had the financial evidence, I had the legal proof of his theft, and I had the emotional fuel for my mother's diary. I spent the rest of the night finalizing the code on the silver USB drive. I made sure it was perfect. There could be no mistakes. In the world of high finance coding, a single misplaced comma can ruin everything. I tested the script on a sandbox server, a safe, isolated computer environment, and watched as it successfully simulated the freezing of 10 billion virtual dollars in under 30 seconds. It worked. The loser had built a cage that no billionaire could break. I looked at the drive sitting on my desk. It looked so harmless, just a small bit of metal. But it was a bomb, and I was the one holding the remote. I thought about the retirement party. I knew exactly what Richard would say. I knew exactly how he would try to humiliate me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. I realized that Richard's greatest mistake wasn't being mean. It was being arrogant enough to think that the person who built his world wouldn't be the one to take it apart. The secret was no longer a burden. It was my power. The tension in the office during the final 2 weeks before the retirement party was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every time the elevator doors opened, I felt like a spy behind enemy lines. Richard was in a state of high-energy arrogance, strutting through the hallways like he already owned the moon, while Victor Hale followed him like a loyal shadow, clutching his leather briefcase full of stolen dreams. They had no idea that the quiet girl in the corner office was actually the architect of their destruction. I spent my days performing a delicate dance of deception. I had to look busy enough to avoid suspicion, but not so busy that they would look at my screen. I kept my silver USB drive hidden in a small, velvet-lined pocket inside my laptop bag, a tiny weight that felt like 100 pounds of responsibility. One morning, my father burst into my office without knocking, his face red with excitement. He dropped a thick stack of papers on my desk and told me he needed a final security sweep of his personal accounts before the big night. He wanted to make sure everything was perfect for his transition into retirement. I realized right then that he was handing me the keys to the vault. He was asking me to check the very systems I had already rigged. It was the ultimate test. As he stood there, leaning over my shoulder, I could smell his expensive cologne and the faint scent of the cigars he smoked to celebrate his wins. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the interface, but I forced my breathing to slow down. I opened a dummy screen, a fake version of the system, and showed him a series of green lights and security-confirmed messages. He patted me on the back, a heavy, dismissive gesture, and said, "Good girl, Maya. At least you're useful for something." That comment, which once would have hurt me, now felt like a final confirmation that I was doing the right thing. He walked out, laughing with Victor about a golf trip they had planned for the following month, completely unaware that by next month he wouldn't even be able to afford the golf balls. As the days crawled toward the Friday of the party, the risks became even greater. Victor Hale started getting suspicious. He was a greedy man, and greedy men are often paranoid. He noticed that the server speeds were slightly slower than usual, a side effect of the massive data backup I was running in the background. One evening, after everyone else had left, I was still at my desk, watching a progress bar that seemed to be stuck at 89%. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway flickered, and I heard the sound of heavy footsteps. It was Victor. He walked into my office, his eyes narrow, and his voice dripping with faint concern. He asked me why I was still there, and his eyes drifted toward my laptop. I didn't close the screen. That would look too guilty. Instead, I pulled up a complicated-looking spreadsheet of tax codes. I looked up at him, rubbing my eyes to look tired, and told him I was trying to find a way to save the company another 3% on the retirement fund migration. Victor's greed immediately took over. The moment he heard save money, his suspicion turned into interest. He leaned in, looking at the fake numbers I had generated, and spent 20 minutes telling me how I should optimize the theft he thought I didn't know about. I sat there, nodding and taking notes, while in the hidden background of my computer, the real files were finally finishing their transfer to my encrypted cloud storage. When he finally left, I felt a wave of cold sweat break across my forehead. I had been seconds away from being caught. It was a reminder that Richard and Victor weren't just arrogant. They were dangerous. If they found out what I was doing, they wouldn't just fire me. They would find a way to make sure I never worked again. Or worse. The weekend before the party, I went back to my mother's diary. One last time. I needed to remind myself why I was doing this. I read the entry from the night I was born. My mother wrote about how Richard didn't even come to the hospital until the next day because he was busy closing a deal. She wrote that she looked into my eyes and saw a quiet strength that she hoped would protect me from the world Richard was building. I realized then that my father's retirement party wasn't just a celebration of his career, it was a celebration of his cruelty. He wanted the world to see him as a king, but he was a king who had built his palace on the bones of other people's hard work. I spent Sunday night finalizing the erase command. I added a special feature to the code, the mirror reveal. It wouldn't just freeze his accounts. It would send a personalized email to every person he had ever cheated, explaining exactly how much he had taken from them and where it had gone. I wanted there to be no shadows left for him to hide in. I looked at the silver USB drive and felt a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is messy and loud, like my father. I was precise and cool, like the code I had written. I was the loser who had learned how to turn silence into a weapon. Monday morning was the hardest day of my life. I had to walk into that office and act like a loyal employee while knowing that in 4 days, the building would be filled with investigators and angry shareholders. The atmosphere was electric. Richard had ordered the catering staff to bring in $5,000 worth of sushi for lunch, and the office was filled with the smell of expensive food and the sound of people kissing up to the great man. I stayed in my office, skipped the lunch, and focused on the final handshake between my USB drive and the main server. I had to make sure that the moment Richard plugged it into his laptop at home, it would bypass the company's firewall from the inside. It was like building a key for a door that hadn't been built yet. I spent hours testing the encryption layers. I used a zero-knowledge proof method, which meant that the system would verify the command without ever seeing the actual data until it was too late to stop it. It was a masterpiece of software engineering. If I had shown this to any other company, they would have hired me as a chief technology officer on the spot. But Richard just thought I was Maya, the girl who is good with spreadsheets. That was his greatest mistake. He assumed that because I didn't talk like a shark, I didn't have teeth. Tuesday and Wednesday were a blur of meetings and fake smiles. Linda, my stepmother, called me 4 times to talk about the seating chart. She wanted to make sure I was seated as far away from the stage as possible, near the kitchen doors, so I wouldn't ruin the photos. I told her it was fine. I told her I didn't mind. Inside, I was thinking about the fact that she wouldn't even be in those photos for long, because once the scandal hit, every social club in the city would delete her name from their guest lists. On Thursday night, the night before the party, I couldn't eat. I sat in my apartment, watching the city lights, and I felt a moment of doubt. Was I being too mean? Was I destroying a man's life just because of a few insults? I opened the Project Sunshine folder, one last time. I looked at the file of Mr. Henderson, the janitor. He was 70 years old and still working because his pension had mysteriously shrunk. I looked at the medical bills Sarah, the receptionist, couldn't pay. The doubt vanished. This wasn't revenge. It was an audit. Richard Reynolds had spent 40 years taking things that didn't belong to him. I was simply the one who was going to balance the books. I put the silver USB drive into a small box, wrapped it in simple white paper, and went to bed. I slept for 10 hours, the best sleep I had had in years. I knew that when I woke up, the world would still think I was a loser. But by the time I went back to sleep the next night, the world would know the truth. The buildup was over. The stage was set. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the script. The Meridian Hotel's grand ballroom was a sea of glittering crystal, expensive silk, and the heavy scent of arrogance. This was the night Richard Reynolds had waited for his entire life. A coronation disguised as a retirement party. I stood near the back by the kitchen doors, exactly where my stepmother Linda had placed me. I felt like a ghost watching a play. Every person in that room was a millionaire or a billionaire, and almost every single one of them had benefited from the systems I had spent 10 years building in the dark. As I watched my father move through the crowd, laughing loudly and slapping backs, I felt the silver USB drive in my small black clutch bag. It felt cold, like a key to a prison cell. Richard finally stepped up to the microphone, the room falling into a respectful, hungry silence. He spoke for 20 minutes about discipline, toughness, and the killer instinct. He talked about how he built his empire with his own 2 hands, never mentioning my mother's inheritance, or the thousands of employees he had cheated. Then came the moment that changed everything. He looked toward my table, his face twisted into a smug grin, and delivered the insult that would cost him everything. He called me a loser in front of the world. He said I lacked the spark to be a real Reynolds. The laughter that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard, but it was also the last time those people would ever laugh with him. I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. I walked up that stage, handed him the drive, and walked out into the cool night air. I didn't go to a bar or a friend's house. I went straight to my apartment, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. I had a mirror screen of Richard's home computer. I knew that despite his arrogance, Richard was curious. He wouldn't be able to resist seeing what was on that drive. At 11:42 p.m., a notification popped up on my screen. External device connected. My heart stopped for a second. This was it. The erase command was no longer a plan. It was a reality. The code I had written, the one that had taken me months to perfect, sprang to life. It didn't just delete files, it acted like a digital fire. First, it bypassed the hotel's guest Wi-Fi security and tunneled directly into the Reynolds International mainframes, using the backdoor I had created years ago. I watched the live logs on my screen as the script began the asset freeze protocol. One by one, the red lights started flashing on my dashboard. Bank of Zurich, frozen. Cayman Trust, locked. Purchased, locked. Singapore Holdings, audit triggered. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. The code was moving faster than any human could react. It was a 70-minute video of his life's work being dismantled in seconds. Suddenly, my phone started buzzing. It was a notification from the company's internal emergency alert system. The Project Sunshine files were being broadcast. Every employee, from the high-level VPs to the janitors in the basement, was receiving a secure link to the evidence of the pension theft. I could almost hear the collective gasp of thousands of people across the country. But the most important part was the net worth eraser. Richard's personal wealth was tied to complex algorithms that traded stocks automatically. My code didn't just stop the trades, it reversed them based on the illegal insider data I had found in Victor Hale's secret folders. The numbers on Richard's private dashboard began to spin backward. 400 million, Manny 16.5. 400 million, Manny 16 billion, A, Manny 16.5. 400 million dollars to his K, 300 million, 100 million. It looked like a countdown to zero. At the same time, the script sent a massive whistleblower packet to the IRS and the Securities and Exchange Commission. It contained every fake invoice, every hidden tax document, and the digital proof of my father's fraud. There was no way out. The system he had trusted to protect him was now the very thing that was stripping him bare. I watched the screen as the final handshake was completed. The script ended by changing the administrative passwords to every single account Richard owned. He was now locked out of his own life. He couldn't pay for his house. He couldn't pay for his cars. And he couldn't even pay for the champagne he had just served at the hotel. I saw a notification that Victor Hale had tried to log in from a remote location, probably a private airport, but the system had already flagged his passport and sent his location to the authorities. The loser had won. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. I looked at the photo of my mother on my desk and realized that her legacy was finally safe. I wasn't just a daughter who had been hurt. I was the person who had finally balanced the books. I closed my laptop, walked to my window, and watched the sun start to rise over the city. I knew that when Richard woke up the next morning, he would be a man with a big name and a $0 balance. The climax was over, but the story of his downfall was just beginning to be written in the morning news. The sun rose over the city the next morning, but for Richard Reynolds, the world was dark. I sat in my small kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee, and watched the news. The headlines were already screaming: Reynolds international scandal, pension theft exposed, and Billionaire's accounts frozen in massive fraud probe. My phone was silent because I had changed my number, but I could imagine the chaos at the Meridian Hotel and the Reynolds mansion. By 9 a.m., I received a notification that the board of directors had held an emergency meeting and officially removed Richard as chairman. Victor Hale had been arrested at a private airfield trying to board a plane to Dubai. The system I had built didn't just take their money. It took their freedom. I felt a strange sense of quiet. It wasn't the loser kind of quiet my father used to mock. It was the quiet of a job well done. I had returned every cent of the stolen pension money to the employees. I had transferred my mother's stolen inheritance into a charitable trust that would help young girls learn to code and build their own futures. I had balanced the books, not just for the company, but for my life. An hour later, there was a knock at my door. I knew who it was. I opened it to find Richard standing there. He wasn't wearing his $5,000 suit. He was wearing a wrinkled shirt, and his hair was messy. For the first time in 32 years, he looked small. He didn't shout. He didn't call me names. He just looked at me and asked, "How? How did you do it, Maya? I built that world. I owned those servers. How could a girl like you take it all down in one night?" I led him into my apartment, the modest apartment he used to call a shack. We sat at my small wooden table. I told him everything. I told him about the safety switch I had built years ago. I told him about the mirror files, the printer software backdoors, and the digital footprints Victor had left behind. I told him that while he was busy being the loudest person in the room, I was busy being the smartest. But then, I pulled out my mother's diary. I pushed it across the table toward him. "This is why I did it, Dad," I said. "It wasn't because you called me a loser. I've been a loser in your eyes forever. I did it because you stole from Mom. You stole from the janitor. You stole from Sarah. You thought people were just tools to be used, but tools can break, and sometimes, the person who fixes the tools is the one who decides when the machine stops running." Richard looked at the diary, but he didn't open it. He couldn't. He knew what was inside. He put his head in his hands and started to cry. It wasn't a sad cry. It was the cry of a man who realized he had lost a game. He didn't even know he was playing. He told me he had nothing left. The house was being seized. Linda had already left him and was staying with her sister. His friends from the party weren't answering his calls. I looked at him and felt a tiny bit of pity. but I didn't feel regret. You have exactly what you gave me for 30 years, Dad, I told him. You have yourself. And since you're such a winner, I'm sure you'll find a way to build it all back from nothing, this time without stealing. I gave him a small envelope with a few $100s. Enough for a week at a cheap motel and some food. It was more kindness than he had ever shown me. As he walked out the door, he turned back and said, "You really do have the killer instinct, Maya." I shook my head and smiled. No, Dad. I have the architect's instinct. I don't kill things. I just move them back to where they belong. I spent the rest of the day walking through the city park. I saw people sitting on benches, kids playing, and birds flying. None of these people knew my name. None of them knew that I had just moved $400 million around like pieces on a chessboard. And that was okay. I didn't need the applause of a ballroom. I didn't need a gold watch or a mahogany table. I had my mother's heart and my own brain, just like the diary said. I had realized that your worth isn't what people say about you at a party. It's what you know about yourself when you're alone in the dark. I had set myself free from the need for his approval. I was no longer the loser daughter or the invisible analyst. I was Maya, the woman who knew how to speak the language of the future. To everyone watching this video, I want you to remember one thing. Never be afraid of being the quietest person in the room. People will mistake your silence for weakness. They will mistake your kindness for a lack of ambition. They will call you a loser because they are afraid of how much space you take up without saying a word. But remember that the loudest person is often the one with the most to hide, and the quietest person is often the one who holds the key to the exit. If you are being underestimated today, don't waste your energy trying to convince them otherwise. Use that energy to build your own system. Learn a skill nobody else understands. Map out the world while they are busy bragging about it. And when the time is right, hand them your own USB drive. You don't have to defeat them with anger. You can defeat them with the truth. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey. If this story of justice and quiet strength meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Remember, your value is not a number in a bank account. It's the integrity in your soul. I'll see you in the next story. Goodbye for now.